Hi, my name is Tynette Deveaux, and I'm really happy I can join you today as part of this conference on the climate crisis. You may recognize my name from Buddha Dharma, the Practitioners Quarterly. I was the founding editor of the publication, and it was a position I held for nearly 20 years. I left that work at the beginning of 2020 in order to focus my efforts on addressing the climate crisis. So what I'll do over the next few minutes is just share a little bit of what I've come to understand about the climate crisis, not only in terms of the urgency of it, but what it might take to turn things around. So let's start with where we are today. We know things are bad. All we have to do is look around us. I invite you as well to consider a question as you listen to this presentation and the other presentations during this conference. And that is simply, how will you be changed by what you know? It's one thing to take all this information in, but how do you take it in a way that makes it meaningful and that you can translate into some kind of action? We know from various international reports that the goal is to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, and that's 1.5 above pre-industrial temperatures. We are already at 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming, and we're seeing the impacts of that everywhere. Just over the past year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with several reports, and the last one is sort of dubbed the Now or Never report, where we're told that if in order to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, that global emissions have to have already peaked by 2025 and need to be cut in half by 2030. Now, unfortunately, although the requirements of immediate drastic reductions in greenhouse gases is super clear, each country that goes away from international conferences seem to continue to speak about 2050. So all of the countries and corporations are talking about net zero by 2050, but we know that that will be far too late. Another thing I'll just mention, this is a photograph from the international COP26 meeting that was held in Glasgow not long ago. And you may find it interesting to know that there were more fossil fuel lobbyists there than representatives from any single country. So if fossil fuels had been a country, they would have been the most represented at COP26. So 1.5, well, first of all, as you can see from this map here, parts of the United States are already warming well beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are land temperatures, and it kind of gives you, these hotspots kind of give you a window into the future of what that experience is like. And it's rough. So I live in Canada, where warming is happening at twice the rate as the rest of the world. And in the northern part of Canada, the average temperature increase has already reached 2.3 degrees. So what does this mean? It means different things depending on where you live. In India and Pakistan this year, temperatures reached 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And people died. Harvests were destroyed, which led to greater food insecurity. And now, there's more conversation about temperatures that are beyond the ability of the human body to adapt to. We know that Europe has experienced a terrible heat wave since June, and it's having devastating effects. The fires are raging in Europe and elsewhere as a result of the drier, hotter conditions. And the fires are so hard to put out. We know that droughts are happening everywhere. This is a photograph taken in Texas. Here's one taken in India. And so depending on where you live, your ability to cope with the impacts of a drought are going to be significantly different. The same goes for floods, which are becoming more common and more extreme. Here's one photo from Montana, and here's one from Bangladesh. So everywhere you look, there are, harmful effects of climate change. This isn't something off into the future, which is how it was perhaps perceived even, 5-10 years ago. It is here, it is now, it is disproportionately impacting Indigenous people and Black people and people of color. This is a photograph taken in northern Alberta in a place called Fort McMurray, where we have the tar sands. And one of the outcomes of the climate crisis is that more and more people are having to leave their home countries in desperation because they simply cannot support themselves, their families, where they currently are. And we know, of course, that not only are people being severely impacted, but also wildlife and domesticated animals everywhere. Now, I know I'm talking about climate here, but it is it's so much more than climate change. It is biodiversity loss, which is human-caused as well. This is a photograph of an area that's been clear-cut, and we know factories are polluting the air and the water, as is mining. And so I think, generally when we're talking about the climate crisis, we're talking about all of this. And it just so happens that the climate crisis seems to be an easier way of kind of entering the conversation, because we can talk about a temperature and we can immediately relate to the impact of a heat wave, for example, or a devastating flood. But it's all of this. one of the things that I've found particularly challenging is holding the awareness of what's actually happening, not only close to home, but around the world, and feeling that people around me sort of are not aware of how serious things have gotten. And you can start to feel a little bit crazy, like you're wondering, is this some kind of dream that you're living that nobody else around you seems to get? But you're not crazy if you hold this awareness. And when you start to look for people who understand, you will absolutely find them. And so together, there's a community of people around the world who are doing what they can to address the crisis. One of the things I would suggest not doing is focusing on sort of the humanity versus the planet dichotomy. Simply because I think that obscures the structures of power, which are at the root of not only the problem, but how to change the problem. Not all people are impacting the planet equally, and there are people and corporations and governments who are impeding the changes that are needed. And they're doing this because of very entrenched systems of power. So we have to be able to talk about that and not simply focus on sort of personal, individual carbon footprints. So we do know that global negotiations and promises, agreements, you name it, they're failing. I don't say this to be glib. I'm simply being realistic that it does not appear that at the global level we have sufficient commitments and even the ability to force governments to honor the commitments they've made. We know that fossil fuel companies are pushing back in myriad ways to slow down the transition to clean renewable energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They've become particularly effective at greenwashing, and so now you'll hear companies talking about net zero oil drilling and by such and such a year. But there is no such thing as net zero when we're talking about fossil fuels. It is simply a manufactured idea that is not based on anything real. In addition to the fossil fuel companies, being very effective with greenwashing and misinformation, they've also tried to shift the blame to everyday people. So in 2000, British Petroleum came out with this handy-dandy carbon footprint calculator so that people could, plug in their power usage, their energy usage, and find out how much they were impacting the planet. Now, there's nothing wrong with knowing what your carbon footprint is, but the impact of that was to shift the focus away from corporations and governments that are subsidizing fossil fuel companies and the banks that are financing them, it's shifted the attention away from all of that to, did I drive this many miles or kilometers today, and where did I buy my coffee? So, it's a form of gaslighting, and we need to call it for what it is. I'll also point out that, this is a chart of banks that are funding fossil fuels in the billions of dollars. So again, going back to the idea that this is not simply, a case of humanity gone wrong, there are some very orchestrated players in this, and we need to be able to call them out if we're going to change things. I'll also point out that economic inequality has grown enormously, particularly since the 1990s and the era of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Stephen Harper. Neoliberalism supported deregulation, and you probably know from your own experience that people are being squeezed more and more. Not only are we seeing these differences exacerbated between countries, between the global north and south, but also within countries. So for example, within the United States and within countries in Europe, there is greater income inequality. And so our impact is not equal when it comes to, what's causing the climate crisis. So global methane emissions, I wanted to point this out because there's been a shift towards what's called natural gas, so-called natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. There's nothing more natural about that kind of gas than coal or oil. Again, a really good marketing branding, but the International Energy Agency recently reported that the emissions from natural gas drilling and pipeline leaks and burning of natural gas is actually 70% higher than is being reported. Why is that important? Well, actually, methane emissions are 86 times more potent when it comes to warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And their impact is experienced primarily in the first 20 years. So these next few years, and certainly the 20-year span, is critical for the outcome that we're going to see. And the other thing that, this drives home to me is that the greenhouse gas emissions aren't all being counted. And I think there's a lot of, intentional underreporting by corporations and by governments, and the way that the systems have been set up to capture that information. So we can't rely on these promises to get us anywhere near a kind of net zero scenario. So where does that leave us? Lately, I've been talking to people about the Hunger Games. This is, I read the trilogy with my son when he was young. And it seems to describe the situation that we find ourselves in today, where, people are still doing the work of oil and gas drilling and coal mining because they are forced to, feed their families, and there are no other jobs in their areas. And we're also, whether we see it directly or not, we're impacting people elsewhere. So for those who are able to live comfortably in North America, the immediate impact is that people in the global south will be paying the price for our comfort. So, I would encourage you to think about this as a Hunger Games, and a Hunger Games that we didn't create, actually, not most of us. It is, in the Hunger Games, there's the capital, and it's a group of elites who live very well, and they've created the game and the way it's played and the rules, and it seems rather intractable. But I won't spoil the ending. But it's not impossible to overcome. I try to remind people that I really do think we have more power than we realize, and I think one of the most radical, disruptive, and powerful things we can do is to share the stories of where people are succeeding and communities are managing to transition off of fossil fuels and do good, despite what's stacked up against them. I've grown particularly fond of working in the area of energy democracy. So this is looking at energy that is owned by the people. It can come in the form of a cooperative model or a municipal utility. And because it's not geared towards private profit, it's actually looking at what the needs of the community are, and any revenue that's generated is going straight back into those communities, whether it's supporting the infrastructure for the community energy systems, or building a daycare, or helping to bring broadband internet to rural areas, or addressing energy poverty, and producing energy efficiency programs. So this is happening all over the world, and it's not headline news. And if you just even do a search, an internet search on energy democracy, you may find some examples of it close to home. So just bringing it back to my starting question, how will you be changed by what you know? I would encourage you not to feel overwhelmed, and to look at, within your sphere, what influence might you have? I think we really want to stop looking to others to save us. I don't think anyone's coming to save us, but I think as individuals in community, we have power, and we can support change, and sometimes even just showing what's possible is the change that's needed, because it disrupts the dominant narrative that, for example, transitioning off fossil fuels is either too expensive, too hard, or the technology isn't there yet. That's actually a lie. And I would encourage you to lean into that, and if you're not certain about that, and find out for yourself. I've done my homework, and I feel confident in calling out that lie. We have the solutions available to us. It's not more expensive than transitioning to other fossil fuels, and it's happening. We're seeing it happening on a much smaller scale, and it could be scaled up if we can root out the systems that are preventing it.